For the reasons I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognize the State of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025.
Well, we can see now that Mark Carney is desperate to try to distract the Canadian population from the impending economic collapse. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. Mark Carney and the far left are trying to distract from the idea that our country is breaking apart, that our economic situation is horrid. He promised us as a businessman that he was going to be able to deal with Donald Trump. I assured all of you before the election that he was not the man for the job. I believe we can see now without a doubt that he is not the man for the job. I mean, Donald Trump has sealed deals with countries that have diametrically opposed to the United States, and yet he still managed to close deals with them. And Canada, who by Mark Carney's own account has had a long-standing tradition of cooperation and international trade, cannot seal the deal because Mark Carney cannot see the woods for the trees. Now, becoming desperate, he's trying to appeal to his base. He's trying to make everybody think that he has an understanding and experience not only of international diplomacy, but of a conflict that has been raging for many, many years and has so many subtle nuances that individuals who are not schooled in these kinds of things would get lost almost in a moment. This, of course, is one of the biggest problems that we have by electing someone like Mark Carney, who has no diplomatic experience, who he proudly brags that his first foray into politics was to be anointed the leader of Canada. He doesn't understand what he's talking about. He doesn't understand what he's putting us up against. He just knows that by introducing the conversation, he just hopes that by introducing the conversation, he can create the divisions that he relies on so heavily. The advice that his people are giving him are to turn away from the United States approach and cozy up to France, cozy up to England. I don't want to dive too far into the whole quagmire that is down there. I'm not trying to talk to you about the history or the changes and all of that. I will, however, be discussing some of the things that I have already said in this channel and how those things are actually coming to bear out right now. Further, we will be discussing as Canadians our leadership being so uncertain in this acknowledgement of Palestine. Because when some of his bought and paid for reporters confronted him with questions speaking from a position of at least informed ideas, the reporters really put him on the spot. They really had him stumbling. They really had him sputtering all over again. Now that matters to you and I because we are already in a very uncertain and precarious position in this country. Mark Carney, not having any understanding of diplomacy, was not the right man for the job, clearly. But everybody said, no, he's going to be able to solve the economy. And now that he can't solve the economy, he's forced to take a detour into regions that he's not safe and not comfortable in. And we can see by the destroyed relationship that we have with India, just how important these kinds of comments can lead to. Before we break down Mark Carney's clear uncertainty and his desperation, there's a couple of things I would say. First, I made it very plain on one of the very first videos I made after the October 7th, we'll use the word incident. There was no way in the world that Israel was not going to use this as a reason to remove the Gaza Strip. And you might be asking yourself, well, what are we doing then? Why are we bothering with this? What are you talking about? What evidence do you have to support that? Well, I have some understanding of the situation, and I'm going to show you something that most people don't seem to want to understand, or they overlook, or they simply are uneducated. I mean, many people who are picketing and running up and down Canada streets complaining about this region cannot even find it on a map. So let's just take a look at one of the things, because it's important to what Mark Carney is having to say. This is the current map, or at least near enough, of the region that we're talking about. And you can see in the red, we have two sections of red. These are what's known as Palestinian areas. Now, the West Bank, which is the red one there, being called the West Bank because it's on the west bank of the river Jordan, has a different political group governing it than the Gaza Strip, which you can see down there just between Israel and Egypt. Now, we can talk all about how that's a great location. It's on the Mediterranean and everything is wonderful. What I would show you before I go ahead to give you an idea of the region, to give you an idea of what we're talking about. You see the little section of Gaza Strip that's touching on Egypt. Now, you would think, well, if they're having such humanitarian issues, why would we not give the food to Egypt? And Egypt can simply go in there and give the Palestinian situation and give them all kinds of, bring peace and security to this particular section of the Palestinian areas of the Middle East. And I want to show you what the border, that little tiny strip of border right there, I want to show you what it looks like in actual truth. So that little section, that little strip, this is the border of it. This is an image of the Egypt-Gaza Strip border. You can see it's, I think, 7 layers. 2 rows of barbed wire. One of these walls is actually down to the bedrock. So they're guesstimating it at about 25 meters, which for you and I walking around every day, if you want to understand what that means, it's about a 6-story building into the ground so that there can be no tunneling from one country to the other country. Okay, so back to the map. We can see the green part is Israel, and we can talk about whatever you want, but you heard Mark Carney, or you will hear when I show you in a minute, Mark Carney say a couple of things about the annexation of the Gaza Strip and how the Knesset has said it, and that he's in talks with Abbas. So the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are the 2 governments in Palestine. No matter what you tell yourself about acknowledging it or whatever, for the purposes of this video, we can see those 2 red sections on the map, and those 2 red sections are what is traditionally or classically or currently known as Palestine. However, they have 2 separate governments. So they are not in unison. The Gaza Strip has a government you know as Hamas. The West Bank has a government that you may know little about called the Palestinian Authority. So when you hear Mark Carney talking this way, you hear him mentioning all of these things, he's talking about the leader of the West Bank. I just want you to understand the kind of mess that Mark Carney is diving into in an effort to hide the fact that he cannot negotiate a deal and that he has no idea how to solve the economic problems of Canada. And he would much rather stick Canada into this than admit that to the people and simply step aside and allow us to find a leader that can do the problem.
In recent days, I've spoken with our allies, including President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, President von der Leyen. I've also had a number of discussions with our ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray. Prospects for a 2-state solution have been steadily and gravely eroded, including by the pervasive threat of Hamas terrorism to Israel and its people, culminating in the heinous attack of October 7th, 2023, the terrorist organization Hamas's long-standing violent rejection of Israel's right to exist and its rejection of a 2-state solution.
You heard him say heinous, right? Because the word that they put into his speech was heinous. But he's not speaking his own words, so he didn't know enough to make the correction. He simply read what was in front of him. That's a clue, because he's not talking now. He's being told what to say.
The accelerated settlement building across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, all the while settler violence against Palestinians has soared, has also undermined the process, as have actions such as the E1 settlement plan and this month's vote by the Knesset calling for the annexation of the West Bank. For the reasons I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognize the state of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state. The representations that have been made by the Palestinian Authority, representations that have been made now several times, both publicly spoken, in writing to me as Prime Minister, and representations that I tested, if you will, President Abbas in a lengthy and robust call today to confirm the intentions and the ability to do so.
So you heard him. He talked about the West Bank. He talked about East Jerusalem. He talked about how he has been given assurances by the leader of the West Bank. No mention of the Gaza Strip. Can we take from that the indication that the Americans have given Gaza Strip to the Israelis for their efforts against the Iranians? Have we worked out some sort of a deal in the Middle East to at least bring some sort of quasi peace to the region? It's my speculation that that was one of the prices that the Americans paid for the initial weakening of the Iranian regime. That the Americans would support Israel in the annexation of not the West Bank, but the Gaza Strip, without a doubt. And now we can see that parts of Europe, the EU, France, Britain, those leaders are trying to drag Canada in with them to acknowledge that the Palestinians exist, but only in the West Bank. I don't know that we should be sticking our nose into it at all. I'm just pointing out what Mark Carney is trying to say in his effort to distract. And I'm going to show you some more stuff of how uncertain and how insecure his answers are, and how we as Canadians need to see that for what it is.
It's not been clear, say, in the last 48 hours that either the Netanyahu government or Hamas is at all interested in these conditions. And so who's going to make them?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, Hamas, I don't know, Hamas is not welcome in any way, shape, or form. So, of course, and one of the issues is not to give Hamas in any way, shape, or form a veto over a process that affects both the Israeli and Palestinian people. I could say much harsher things, and I should say much harsher things about Hamas, but that's a basic structural point. There are some in positions of influence in the state of Israel that do not want a two-state solution, that are taking actions to frustrate that actively. And we are part of a growing and very significant international community that is leaning against that, that is prioritizing the possibility and the prospect for a two-state solution. There are other measures that can be taken. For now, what we're doing is to promote a positive process towards it.
Now, we heard Mark Carney stutter through that answer. And if you watch the entire thing, I'll leave a link, you will see him stutter left, right, and center. Personally, I believe that that's for two reasons. One, he has no idea about what he's doing. He's just not, he has no training in diplomacy. He has no training in politics. He has no training in these things, which the leader of our country should have, especially when you consider the fabric of our nation. You have to be able to talk to all groups, not tell one group one thing and then tell another group another thing. That is not diplomacy. You have to be able to speak to them all. Essentially, being the Prime Minister of Canada means that you have to be able to know how to speak to every country on earth, because every country on earth has people represented inside of our borders. Now, leaving that aside, leaving aside the amount of people in Canada that currently regret their vote, I believe that what really sort of took him out of his headspace was the fact that like an example of that reporter, she clearly has a personal investment in this conflict in the Middle East, that she's probably more well-versed in it than he is. And I believe he read that on her face, or there was something about the way that she was standing, or perhaps the tone. What I know is that when he read the room, finally, he realized how far in over his head that he was, and you heard how that shattered his confidence. Stumbling and stuttering and and ah. Because not only does he not have a clue what he's doing, but so if we say that he has no clue what he's doing, then why would he be up there talking about it? Well, he's up there talking about it because he needs to distract Canadians from the real pressures and the real problems the promises that he made. When all else fails, I guess you just reach out for the Middle East. One thing that he added that is really shocking to me, really surprising to me, that I'm really going to that is really going to bring up problems to this country. He said something other than he spoke to how he's going to also introduce legislation in the Canadian Parliament over this particular issue. And I think that we need to hear that announcement because it is in many ways going to be more significant than acknowledging Palestine.
And it's why we're introducing legislation this fall that will make it a criminal offense to intentionally and willfully obstruct access to any place of worship, to schools and community centers. We will also invest in the physical protection of vulnerable communities and places of worship. Basic security is an inalienable right of every human being. We'll defend that right for every Canadian.
Well, whether or not we acknowledge Palestine has nowhere near the impact as this off-the-cuff remark about introducing legislation to protect places of worship or community centers and to arrest people who try to get in the way of that. First, let me just say that Canada, by my last count, has had arson in nearly 130 churches. And just last weekend, at the time of recording, a man walked into a church in downtown Montreal and fired 2 smoke bombs at a person who was singing on stage. I wonder if these protections that he refers to will extend to the Christian faith. And I further wonder when he says we're going to be investing in security for these places. Is that you're going to cut a check? Or are you going to try to hire a special police force? Because one thing I can tell you, you can't just assign people to these areas. You can't all of a sudden assign for example, a police officer who is of one faith to defend the building of another faith, not based on your argument that we're trying to protect the faith. Now, I personally don't see how an individual would have much problem with that if their first faith is to keep the rule of law. If their first belief is to follow the rule of law and to create a society that is functions and is safe and is secure. But let's be straightforward. We have many police officers in this country who might not be so strong that way. And that's not to throw shade on our police forces. That's just throw shade on the policies that the governments have been following over the last decade. So what are you going to do now? Give checks to individual community groups for private policing, like we see in many of the other countries? Are we going to now have police forces that are marching in their particular neighborhood and who have a religious affinity to only one thing? Now, I have an issue with that because Canada was founded on the idea of religious security, religious separation. I'm not talking off the cuff here. We literally have laws that don't allow for you to bring religious symbols into our halls of parliament. The biggest example I can think of is that lady in Hamilton who got barred from coming into the Queen's Park in Ontario because she refused to remove her religious symbols. Of course, without ever caring about the history of the country and not understanding that when Queen's Park was put together, it was put together on the idea that we couldn't have Catholics and Protestants having fist fights or worse in the halls of our parliament, which is something that everybody overlooks. The Christian conflicts that were brought to this country are important. I could list off 100 different individual conflicts that have happened in Europe alone that are rooted 100% in Catholic versus Protestant. Now you want to fold into that mix people who don't share the ideals of keeping that separate from our daily lives, or better yet, accepting that we live in a country that allows for that accepts that. And you further want to give funding to individuals to hire private securities, or what we might refer to as a militia, to defend individual religious sites in particular neighborhoods in this. This is not a formula for madness at all. This is really well thought out and clearly comes from the mind of a sharp individual who understands the subtle nuances of religious conflict and who understands the heated passions that men especially can feel when it comes to their places of worship, and the children that they trust to go to said places of worship. Oh yeah, no. Doesn't have a recipe for disaster written all over it at all. Now, many of you asked me my opinion on what I think Canada acknowledging Palestine. And I will say only this. I don't know that we should acknowledge Palestine if Palestine doesn't acknowledge Israel. So there's that. I think that we shouldn't be asked for things that they will not provide. Now, I will leave that to the diplomats, and I say that word and realize that the Liberal Party doesn't really have any of them. Nonetheless, this introduction of legislation into Canada that will allow, potentially, based on his wording, individual religious organizations to now train and equip and pay security for their own particular religious sites. Well, I mean, that's only a minute and a half away from what we're just describing in the Middle East. I'm not telling you that we shouldn't be worried about, that I'm not telling you that people shouldn't be punished for harming or harassing or scaring people that are on their way to these things. I'm telling you that this is a recipe, if not handled correctly, for disaster. And you have to wonder if Mark Carney understood that when he made the announcement, or is he just so far out of his depth that he's saying the words put in front of him that were given to him by people who have ulterior motives and further don't understand how politics in Canada works. We'll have to wait and see when the legislation gets introduced, but I would tell you right now that the way he said it gives me concern. I'm going to wrap here. You can let me know what you think down in the comments. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.